The downtown skyline glowed against the morning sun, and beneath it, a $50 million transformation was taking shape. Steel beams rose like monuments to vision and precision. Concrete foundations held the weight of a company's largest bet in a decade, and overseeing every single moment of this operation was Marcus Johnson. Marcus walked across the construction site with the kind of presence that didn't require volume. He didn't shout orders. He didn't need to. At 48 years old, with 2 decades of experience in the construction industry and 8 years at this company, he had earned something far more valuable than authority. He had earned respect. His team moved around him with practiced efficiency. 200 workers representing different trades and backgrounds, all understanding that Marcus Johnson knew what he was doing. His safety protocols were flawless. His scheduling was meticulous. His budget management was legendary in the company. This project was ahead of schedule and under budget, a combination that shouldn't be possible, but it was because Marcus had figured out how to make teams work at their best. He wore a high-visibility vest that clearly read Site Manager in bold letters. His name tag hung from a lanyard. His hard hat was pristine. His clipboard held blueprints that he reviewed with the same careful attention he gave to everything. Methodical, thorough, complete. The company had already started talking about promoting him to regional director once this project wrapped. He would be managing 5 major projects across the state. His wife, Sarah, a practicing physician, had laughed when he told her. She knew her husband well enough to know that whatever he set out to accomplish, he would accomplish it. Excellence wasn't something Marcus aimed for. It was something he was. Marcus had earned his position the hard way. Growing up in a working-class family, watching his father work as a factory worker and his mother work as a nurse, he understood the value of a day's honest labor. He'd worked his way through community college, then transferred to a state university for his degree in construction management. He'd started at this company as a junior foreman 8 years ago. 3 promotions later, he was here, in charge of 200 people, overseeing millions of dollars in equipment and materials, responsible for delivering a project that would reshape part of the city's downtown landscape. The morning of the incident, everything was running smoothly. Marcus had reviewed the concrete pour schedule. He'd met with structural engineers about beam placement. He'd walked the site with the safety officer checking that every worker had the proper equipment, that every area was properly marked, that every protocol was being followed. By noon, he was satisfied. The site was functioning at peak efficiency. He didn't notice the police cruiser until it was already pulling onto the site. The cruiser wasn't marked with emergency lights. There was no announcement, no radio communication, no visible reason for its presence. It simply appeared driving directly across the site access point and parked in a position that seemed deliberately obstructive. Officer Bradley Thompson exited the vehicle with the kind of deliberateness that suggested he had no intention of being here to help. Thompson was 42, thick-necked, with a permanent scowl that lived on his face like a resident. He'd been on the police force for 18 years. He wore his uniform like a costume, as if the badge had given him permission to become a character rather than a public servant. Locally, he was known for aggressive traffic stops. Those who'd encountered him rarely forgot it. Those who'd filed complaints against him found their complaints disappearing into bureaucratic black holes, settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements, or simply dismissed without explanation. Thompson's personnel file told a story that his colleagues and supervisors seemed content to ignore. 7 complaints for racial profiling over 6 years. 7 complaints that should have triggered investigation, discipline, retraining, or termination. 7 complaints that had instead been handled with the kind of administrative silence that suggested the department had decided Thompson's behavior was acceptable. The analysis of his traffic stops over the past 5 years was more damning than any single complaint. Of 284 stops made by Officer Thompson, 207 involved black or Hispanic drivers. That represented 73% of his stops. The city's black and Hispanic population represented 40% of the total population. The disparity wasn't subtle. It was stark, measurable, and utterly undeniable to anyone willing to look. Thompson had learned over 18 years that looking was optional. The system had allowed him to behave this way with impunity. His supervisors hadn't held him accountable. The union had protected him. The department had settled complaints quietly rather than address the underlying behavior. Thompson had learned that his badge gave him permission to act on his biases, and the institution would back his play. He was about to encounter someone who would refuse to accept that arrangement. Thompson approached Marcus with the kind of tone that suggested he already believed he knew what he was dealing with. "You got work papers, Chief?" The question hung in the air. Marcus was still holding his clipboard, wearing his clearly marked vest, standing in the middle of a construction site he was actively managing. He was being asked for work papers. The question wasn't asked out of confusion. It was asked with the certainty of someone who had already made a conclusion. Marcus's team had stopped working. Jackhammers went silent. Metal clanging ceased. 200 workers watched what was about to happen. Marcus remained calm. His voice was steady professional, the voice of someone who had learned to navigate complex situations with composure. "Officer, I'm the site manager here. My ID and vest clearly indicate that. Is there a specific safety concern I can help you with?" The question was reasonable. The tone was respectful. The offer to assist was genuine. Marcus was giving Thompson an off-ramp, a way to handle this professionally. Thompson didn't take it. "Don't get smart with me," Thompson said, his voice rising slightly. "I've seen a lot of loitering on this site. We've had complaints." Marcus's operational instincts activated. He'd learned over 48 years of life that when someone said they'd had complaints, they rarely meant actual complaints. They meant assumptions. They meant suspicions based on appearance rather than behavior. "What kind of complaints?" Marcus asked. "I can review our security footage and incident reports with you. If there's a legitimate concern, I want to address it." Thompson didn't answer the question. Instead, he shifted his attack. "You got a criminal record." There it was, the opening salvo of a line of questioning designed not to gather information, but to demean. Marcus had heard variants of this before. The goal wasn't to understand. The goal was to establish dominance, to make clear who held power in this interaction. "No," Marcus said. "I'm happy to provide you any documentation you need, but I'd appreciate knowing what this is actually about." His tone hadn't changed. He remained professional. He remained respectful. He remained unmoved by Thompson's attempt at intimidation. Thompson's jaw tightened. The fact that Marcus wasn't responding with fear or capitulation seemed to anger him. He pulled out his citation book. "I'm writing you up for trespassing on a construction site without proper authorization." Marcus's eyes widened. The statement was so divorced from reality that it took a moment to process. He was being cited for trespassing on a site he was managing while wearing a vest that said he managed the site while standing in the position of authority at the site. Officer Marcus said, his voice carefully measured. "I'm not trespassing. I'm the manager of this site. If you'd like to verify that, you can call the company's corporate office. The number is on the sign right there." He pointed to the main gate where the company name and corporate phone number were clearly visible. Thompson looked at the sign. Then he looked back at Marcus. "Don't tell me what to do," Thompson said. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Am I being arrested?" Marcus asked. "Not yet," Thompson said. "But you're about to be if you keep arguing with me." Marcus understood in that moment that there was no correct response. Thompson had decided what this interaction would be. The outcome was predetermined. Any attempt to reason, to provide information, to cooperate would simply provide Thompson with more ammunition. He turned around. Thompson began to pat him down. A frisk that would have been humiliating under any circumstances, but was particularly humiliating when conducted in front of 200 workers who knew exactly what was happening. Everyone on the site had stopped what they were doing. Everyone was watching. One young worker, Danny, 25 years old and relatively new to the team, stepped forward instinctively. "Officer, that's our boss. He's literally in charge here." Thompson turned to Danny with a look that made it clear he was considering adding Danny to whatever false charges he was about to file. "You want to be arrested too, kid," Thompson said. "Step back." Danny stepped back. There was nothing else he could do. Marcus told his team quietly, "It's okay. Let's just let this play out." But his face showed the humiliation, the shock of this moment, the understanding that this was happening, and he couldn't stop it. Thompson found nothing on Marcus. No weapon, no contraband, no evidence of any actual crime. So he pivoted as people with fixed conclusions do when facts don't support their narrative. "Where are you really from?" Thompson demanded. "I'm an American citizen," Marcus replied. "I was born in this state." "Seems pretty convenient," Thompson said. "My driver's license is in my back pocket," Marcus continued, remaining patient despite the absurdity of this conversation. "My social security information is at my home." "I don't carry my social security card. No American does." "Well, that's suspicious," Thompson said. Marcus's phone rang. It was Sarah, his wife. She had a moment free from her medical practice and was checking in as she did most days. Marcus answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't talk right now, honey. I'm being detained by police." Thompson heard this. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost intimate in its menace. "Detained? You're not detained. But maybe you should be." Marcus realized with absolute clarity that this would not end with Thompson simply leaving. There was no combination of facts, no presentation of credentials, no professional response that would satisfy Thompson. Thompson had already decided what was going to happen. Marcus said quietly, with the kind of resignation that comes from understanding that you're about to be put in the back of a police car despite having done nothing wrong. "I want to call my lawyer." Thompson smiled. A cold, satisfied smile that suggested Marcus had just confirmed Thompson's suspicions. "Now you sound guilty," Thompson said. Thompson called for backup, claiming over the radio that Marcus was uncooperative and possibly armed. The statement bore no relationship to reality. Marcus stood calmly, hands visible, offering no resistance. But the narrative had been decided, and the narrative was that Marcus was a threat. 2 more police cars arrived within minutes. Officers exited the vehicles without knowing anything beyond what Thompson had told them. They only knew what Thompson had told them. They knew a supposedly armed, uncooperative suspect was on this site. What they saw when they arrived was a 48-year-old black man in a site manager vest standing quietly while being handcuffed. The handcuffs went on in front of his entire team. 200 workers watched. Marcus was placed in the back of a police car. The charge as it was being filled out was trespassing and disorderly conduct. Charges that were so divorced from reality that they seemed like fiction. But Marcus wasn't in a fictional scenario. He was in the back of a police car, being driven to the precinct, being booked, being placed in a holding cell for 4 hours while his status was processed. The humiliation was complete. The injustice was profound. And Marcus, sitting alone in a holding cell, was trying to understand how any of this had happened. The precinct was a gray building with gray walls containing people in gray circumstances. Marcus had been processed like a piece of inventory. His possessions inventoried, his information recorded, his rights read to him in a tone that suggested they were a formality rather than an actual commitment to protecting him. He was placed in a holding cell with 3 other men. None of them had done anything wrong either. One was there for a traffic stop that had escalated. One was there for a warrant that was from a case his lawyer had already cleared. One was there for suspicion of something. He wasn't entirely clear what. They were all waiting. Marcus's mind was working through the mathematics of this situation. He knew intellectually that the charges against him were baseless. He knew that anyone reviewing the evidence would see that he had committed no crime. He knew that this should be resolved quickly professionally with appropriate apologies for the misunderstanding. He also knew that knowing something intellectually and experiencing something actually were 2 different things entirely. After 4 hours, he was finally allowed one phone call. He used it to contact Michael Torres, a criminal defense attorney he'd found through a Google search and a recommendation from a co-worker's friend. Torres listened to the story. He asked clarifying questions. He took notes. He was quiet for a moment when Marcus finished speaking. "This sounds like racial profiling," Torres said finally. "Let me do some digging. I want to request your arresting officer's personnel file. I want to see if there's a history here." Marcus was released on his own recognizance by 6 p.m. The charges against him would almost certainly be dropped. There was no evidence to support them, no actual crime to prosecute, no reasonable legal theory that would justify the arrest. But that wasn't what bothered Marcus most as he drove home that evening. What bothered him was the violation of it, the deliberate humiliation of it, the calculated disrespect of it, the understanding that someone with authority had decided to wield that authority against him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because of who he was. And that person would probably face no consequences. He'd seen this before in his life. Smaller moments. Comments at the grocery store. Assumptions made at upscale restaurants. Times when he'd been asked if he actually worked at his company or if he was just visiting a site. Times when his professional accomplishments had been attributed to affirmative action rather than merit. He'd learned to push past these moments, to let his work speak for itself, to respond with professionalism and excellence. But this moment was different. This wasn't a comment or an assumption. This was incarceration. This was a police record. This was a humiliation that his team had witnessed. When he got home, Sarah was waiting. She had closed her practice early when Marcus called. She opened the door and saw her husband. Composed but exhausted, humiliated, angry in a way she'd rarely seen. She didn't ask questions. She held him. Later that night, after they'd had dinner, after they'd talked through what had happened, after they'd discussed how they would respond, something shifted in Marcus. He looked at his wife and said, "I'm done staying quiet. This man has to answer for what he did." Sarah nodded. She knew her husband. She knew his integrity. She knew that he would do this not for revenge or for personal satisfaction, but because it was right. "Then we fight," Sarah said. "And we're going to win." The next morning, Torres began the work of investigation. He filed a formal complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division. He submitted a records request for Thompson's complete personnel file. He requested his complaint history. He asked for his traffic stop records from the past 5 years. He also requested all body cam and dash cam footage from the incident. The department legally obligated to comply with such requests complied. What they provided painted a picture far darker than the single incident Marcus had experienced. Thompson's complaint file contained 7 formal complaints spanning 6 years. All were for racial profiling or discriminatory conduct. All had been dismissed or settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements that prevented the victims from speaking publicly about what had happened to them. The traffic stop records were even more revealing. In 5 years, Thompson had made 284 stops. Of those, 207 involved Black or Hispanic drivers. 73%. The city's Black and Hispanic population represented 40%. The disparity was so stark that it demanded explanation, yet the department's response to this data was essentially administrative silence. Torres looked deeper. He analyzed Thompson's searches. 31 searches had been conducted during Thompson's traffic stops. 28 of those 90% involved Black or Hispanic drivers. The result: not a single weapon found, no significant contraband. The searches had been exercises in harassment, not police work. Torres looked at arrest records. Thompson had made 23 arrests in 5 years. 19 involved Black or Hispanic drivers. Of those 19 arrests, 15 were later dropped or dismissed. 2 were overturned on appeal. Only 2 had resulted in convictions. The mathematics were impossible to ignore. Thompson arrested people who matched his bias. The courts proved him wrong more often than not. Yet Thompson continued month after month, year after year, and the department allowed him to continue. Torres compiled all of this into a file. He shared the analysis with Marcus. "You're not the first person this officer has targeted," Torres said. "You're not even close to the first." Marcus and Torres began reaching out to the other victims. Some didn't want to talk. Some had moved on or tried to. Some were afraid. But Torres found 5 who were willing to share their stories. James Miller had been stopped for failure to signal in 2019. His vehicle was perfectly maintained. The charge was later dropped. Thompson had allegedly told him, "People like you need to be held accountable." The city had settled with James for $8,000, but only if he signed an agreement not to discuss what had happened. Keisha Washington had been pulled over in 2021 for suspicious loitering. She'd been waiting for her daughter's school bus. Thompson had asked her where she was really from. He'd searched her car, found nothing, and told her she was lucky. The complaint had been dismissed. Diana Martinez had been stopped in 2022 while pregnant. When she asked why Thompson was stopping her, he'd arrested her for disorderly conduct. The charges were later dropped, but the stress of the arrest had contributed to her daughter being born 3 weeks early. The baby had spent 2 weeks in the neonatal unit. The city had settled with Diana for $6,000. Robert Chen had been stopped in 2021 for an equipment violation on a vehicle with no equipment issues. Thompson had allegedly said, "You people always drive around thinking no one's watching." The stop was eventually determined to be without probable cause. LaToya Johnson had been stopped in 2023 and was detained so long that she missed her son's birthday. 5 other victims, 5 other incidents, 5 other stories of a man in uniform using his authority against people based on how they looked. Torres completed his investigation and presented his findings to Marcus. "You're the lucky one," Torres said quietly. "You have resources, you have a legal team. You have the ability to fight back and actually make it public. These other people, many of them couldn't afford me. Many of them were hurt worse than you were." Marcus understood what Torres was saying. The difference between himself and Keisha, James, Diana, Robert, and LaToya wasn't what Thompson had done to them. Thompson had targeted all of them based on the same bias, the same assumptions, the same prejudice. The difference was whether they had the resources to respond effectively. That understanding crystallized something in Marcus. Meanwhile, Torres continued digging. He requested departmental documents, training materials, policy manuals, performance evaluation criteria. He was looking for the institutional context that allowed Thompson to operate this way. What Torres found exceeded his expectations in its explicitness. Buried in the departmental records was a memo. It was dated 2 years prior. It was addressed to all patrol officers in the division. The subject line read, "Performance metrics and traffic stop quotas." Torres read it twice to make sure he was understanding it correctly. The memo stated, "In order to maintain department effectiveness and accountability, all patrol officers are expected to meet the following performance benchmarks. Minimum 6 traffic stops per week. Minimum 2 vehicle searches per month. Failure to meet these benchmarks will be reflected in performance evaluations and may impact raise and promotion consideration." Torres sat with this document for a long moment. This wasn't a rogue officer acting on personal bias. This was a police department that had institutionalized the incentive to make traffic stops as frequently as possible and to search vehicles as frequently as possible, regardless of whether probable cause actually existed. If an officer made 6 stops per week, that was approximately 312 stops per year. If an officer conducted 2 searches per month, that was 24 searches per year. The department was explicitly incentivizing quantity over quality volume over actual criminal activity. And while the memo didn't explicitly target any racial group, the statistical reality showed that in Thompson's case, and likely in many others, this quota system functioned as a mechanism for racial targeting. Thompson wasn't just a biased officer. Thompson was an officer operating within a system designed to encourage exactly the kind of predatory behavior he was engaging in. Torres called Marcus again. "I found something," Torres said. "This goes way beyond Officer Thompson." One of Marcus's workers had been documenting the incident on his phone. He'd captured Thompson arriving at the site. He'd captured the confrontation. He'd captured Marcus being frisked in front of 30 workers. The video wasn't professionally shot, but it was clear. It showed what had happened. The worker posted it on social media with a caption, "Our site manager was arrested for working, for being a black man in charge, racial profiling, justice for Marcus." Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times. By the next morning, it had thousands of shares. By evening, it had gone viral. 500,000 people had seen the video. Civil rights organizations had started commenting on it. Local news had picked it up. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. The viral moment created political pressure that the police department couldn't ignore. The mayor's office received hundreds of calls demanding explanation. The city council began discussing the incident at their next meeting. Civil rights organizations issued formal statements calling for Officer Thompson's termination. The state attorney general's office announced a preliminary inquiry into Officer Thompson's conduct. Torres submitted the body cam and dash cam footage to the media simultaneously, with his analysis of Thompson's personnel history. Within 24 hours, the video had been viewed 5 million times. News outlets replayed it endlessly. Online analysis broke down frame by frame what had happened. The contrast between Marcus's calm professionalism and Thompson's aggressive intimidation was undeniable. But the real explosive moment came when Torres released the Quota memo. The headline spread across news outlets: "Police Department's Quota System Exposed. Officials incentivized traffic stops that disproportionately targeted minorities." The memo was the smoking gun. It proved that the department hadn't just allowed Thompson to engage in discriminatory conduct. The department had created an institutional structure that incentivized exactly this kind of behavior. Officers who made more stops, regardless of the legitimacy of those stops, received higher performance evaluations. Officers who conducted more searches received promotions and raises. Thompson hadn't invented this system. Thompson had simply been very effective at exploiting it. The data analysis that followed made the implications undeniable. Thompson's 207 stops of black and Hispanic drivers, when the population proportion would have predicted approximately 113 stops, meant he was over-targeting that population by more than 80%. His search rate on black and Hispanic drivers, 90% of his searches, involved people of color, was dramatically higher than on white drivers, even though his success rate, meaning actually finding illegal items, was nearly zero. The quota system had a name now. It was called what it was: a mechanism for generating traffic stops, searches, and arrests through numerical quotas rather than through actual criminal investigation. And while the memo didn't explicitly say focus on black and Hispanic drivers, the data made clear that's how the system functioned in practice. The police chief issued a statement saying the quota system was under investigation. Captain William Hayes Thompson's supervisor was placed on administrative leave pending review. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation into Thompson's conduct. Marcus was invited to provide a statement. He did sitting with Torres in the Internal Affairs office, describing in detail what had happened. He was calm. He was articulate. He was credible. The investigators took extensive notes. Thompson was also interviewed. His story was that Marcus had been uncooperative and that he'd felt threatened. But when confronted with the body cam footage, Thompson's narrative fell apart. The footage showed Marcus being calm, professional, compliant. The footage showed Thompson escalating, not Marcus. The footage showed Thompson's aggression being entirely unprovoked. Thompson's attorney advised him to take a plea deal if one was offered. Thompson began to understand that his career as a police officer was ending. Torres, meanwhile, had reached out to the other victims. James Keisha, Diana Robert, and LaToya. He explained that there was now a public momentum, a moment where their cases could potentially result in justice, rather than just settlements with non-disclosure agreements attached. James agreed to be interviewed. So did Keisha. Diana decided to share her story publicly. Robert and LaToya followed. Their stories combined with the data analysis and the Quota memo created a narrative that was impossible for the department to defend. An officer with a history of discrimination operating within a system explicitly designed to incentivize high-volume stops and searches had engaged in discriminatory conduct against at least 6 people, including Marcus Johnson. The political pressure intensified. The mayor held a press conference denouncing the quota system and announcing a citywide audit of all traffic stops and arrests made in the past 5 years, specifically analyzing whether racial disparities existed. The state legislature began discussing what would eventually become Marcus's law. Legislation requiring all police departments to conduct annual audits of stops and arrests, analyze them for racial disparities, and publish the findings publicly. The Department of Justice began its own federal investigation into whether civil rights violations had occurred. The police union attempted to defend Thompson, releasing a statement saying he was a dedicated officer and that the quota system was standard departmental procedure. But the statement had the opposite effect. Admitting that the quota system was standard procedure was admission that the department had institutionalized discriminatory practices. Thompson's career was over. He knew it. His attorney knew it. Even Thompson's fellow officers who'd once defended him now distanced themselves from him. The internal investigation concluded with findings that Thompson had violated Marcus's civil rights, engaged in discriminatory conduct, abused his authority, and engaged in conduct unbecoming an officer. The report recommended immediate termination. The social media momentum had created something that administrative processes alone couldn't have achieved: public accountability. Every statement the department made was scrutinized. Every attempt to defend itself was analyzed and questioned. A local reporter had dug into the archives and found articles from 2 years prior. When Thompson had been accused of racial profiling by another victim, the department's leadership had said they were committed to fair and equitable policing. The reporter ran a side-by-side comparison of that statement with the Quota memo from that same year, showing the contradiction between the department's public statements and its internal policies. The contradiction was damning. Marcus decided he wanted to speak publicly about his experience. Torres encouraged it, and together they prepared a statement. "This wasn't just about me," Marcus said in his prepared remarks. "Officer Thompson has targeted 6 people that we know of, but the data suggests there are many more. The quota system that incentivized his behavior has been used throughout the department, and the department's response has been to settle these cases quietly with non-disclosure agreements so that people couldn't talk about what had happened. That ends now." The statement was covered by every local news outlet and several national ones. The city council announced they would hold a public hearing to determine what action to take against Officer Thompson and what reforms would be necessary. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away. In those 3 weeks, Torres worked with Marcus and the other victims to prepare testimony. Torres also continued his legal work, filing formal complaints, ensuring that the police personnel files were preserved, coordinating with the State Attorney General's office and the Department of Justice. The day of the hearing arrived. The city council chambers were packed. Media cameras lined the back of the room. Victims were present. Marcus was there with Sarah beside him. Torres sat at the attorney's table with case files organized in front of him. The chief of police presented his findings. Thompson had violated civil rights. Thompson had engaged in discriminatory conduct. The quota system had functioned as a mechanism for racial targeting. The department bore institutional responsibility for allowing this conduct to continue. Council members asked questions. One council member, attempting to defend the police department, asked whether the quota system had been explicitly designed to target minorities. The chief's response was measured. It was designed to maximize stops and searches. The data shows that those stops and searches fell disproportionately on people of color. Whether that was explicit or implicit, the effect was the same. Council member Sarah Chen, who had been following the case closely, asked a direct question to Captain Hayes Thompson's supervisor. "When you implemented these performance metrics, what did you anticipate would happen?" Hayes didn't answer. His attorney instructed him not to. But the question hung in the air, and everyone understood what it meant. The metrics had been implemented knowing, or at minimum being able to foresee, that they would result in discriminatory policing. The victims testified. James Miller described being stopped for a signal violation he hadn't committed. "Officer Thompson told me that people like me needed to be held accountable." Accountable for what? Existing. I'd done nothing wrong. The charge was eventually dropped. But he'd made his point. He'd humiliated me. He'd made clear that he saw me as someone who deserved to be controlled. Keisha Washington described being pulled over while waiting for her daughter's school bus. "He asked me where I was really from. I'm from here. I've lived in this city my whole life. But I understood what he meant. He meant, where was I really from before here? He meant he didn't believe I belonged here. He searched my car. He found nothing. He told me I was lucky. Lucky to not be arrested for being a woman waiting for her child. That's not policing. That's intimidation." Diana Martinez, who was no longer pregnant, but whose daughter was now a healthy toddler, described the stress of being arrested during pregnancy. "My daughter was born 3 weeks early because of the stress of being arrested for asking a question. She spent 2 weeks in neonatal care. Officer Thompson didn't just arrest me, he harmed my child." Robert Chen described being stopped for a phantom equipment violation. "My vehicle was in perfect condition. Officer Thompson knew this because he'd looked at it, but he'd decided I was suspicious and he needed a reason to detain me. He fabricated one." LaToya Johnson described missing her son's birthday due to a traffic stop. "I missed his birthday party because I was detained by Officer Thompson. My child couldn't understand why Mommy wasn't there." These stops don't just humiliate the person being stopped, they damage families. And then Marcus testified. He stood in front of the city council and spoke calmly about what had happened on that construction site. He described being in charge of a 200-person team, overseeing a $50 million project, and being treated like a trespasser at his own job site. He described the humiliation of being frisked in front of his entire team. He described the surreality of being arrested for trespassing at a place he was managing. "I'm the lucky one," Marcus said, his voice steady and measured. "I have resources. I have an attorney. I have a wife who's a physician. I have education and professional standing. I could fight back. I could demand accountability. Many of these other people couldn't. Officer Thompson targeted 6 of us. The data suggests there are many more. The difference between my story and theirs isn't the injustice. The injustice was the same. The difference is that I had the power to make him answer for it. That's not justice. That's luck." The council chamber was silent when Marcus finished. One council member, attempting to defend Thompson's character, suggested that many officers had dedicated their careers to public service and that one incident shouldn't destroy a career. Council member Sarah Chen responded immediately. "One incident. This officer has 7 complaints in his file. He's made over 200 discriminatory stops. 80% of his arrests have been dropped or dismissed. This isn't one incident. This is a pattern. This is ongoing behavior. And it was enabled by a department that created quotas incentivizing exactly this kind of targeting." The council voted. Officer Bradley Thompson's employment was terminated effective immediately. The vote was 7-2, with only 2 members dissenting. The council voted to dismantle the quota system entirely. That vote was 9-0. Unanimous. The council voted to implement mandatory body cam footage review before any arrest was finalized. That vote was 8-1. The council voted to establish a civilian review board with subpoena power to investigate police conduct and make recommendations about discipline. That vote was 8-1. The council voted to require annual training on implicit bias and racial justice issues for all officers. That vote was 9-0. The city offered Marcus a substantial settlement to avoid prolonged litigation. Marcus accepted, but with a condition. He announced publicly that he would donate half to civil rights organizations working on police reform and accountability. The other half would be donated to a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement. In his announcement, Marcus said, "Real change comes when we hold ourselves accountable. I'm using this moment to ensure the next generation of officers understands that their badge comes with a responsibility to serve everyone with dignity." Thompson filed a lawsuit claiming wrongful termination. The case was dismissed by the judge, who noted that the evidence against Thompson was overwhelming and that his termination was legally justified. Thompson eventually accepted a quiet settlement that included a non-disclosure agreement preventing him from discussing the case publicly or from seeking positions in law enforcement in the state. He moved to another state and found work as a private security consultant. His reputation, however, was destroyed. His name became permanently associated with the quota system scandal. He would never wear a badge again. The authority he'd misused was gone. 6 months after the hearing, the construction project Marcus had been managing reached completion. The downtown development had become the landmark it was designed to be. A mixed-use complex with retail, residential, and office space, all built on schedule and under budget. The company celebrated Marcus's completion of the project. More significantly, the board of directors formally approved his promotion to regional director. He would now oversee 5 major projects across the state, managing hundreds of employees, directing tens of millions of dollars in resources. The promotion was deserved, earned through years of excellence and integrity, but it was also symbolic. Marcus had been targeted by someone who saw his competence and his authority through the lens of racial bias. Marcus had responded not by accepting humiliation, but by demanding accountability. And he had succeeded. His team threw him a celebration. Workers who'd witnessed his arrest now watched him stand in front of them as their new regional director. Some of them embraced him, some shook his hand. One older worker who'd been in construction for 40 years told Marcus, "You did what was right. You didn't back down. That's leadership." Sarah attended the celebration, standing beside her husband, proud of the man she'd married. A man who, when faced with injustice, had chosen to fight rather than to accept. Their children, both in college and doing well academically, were proud as well. One of them, the younger, had decided to pursue a degree in criminal justice with a focus on police reform and accountability. Inspired in part by what his father had experienced and how his father had responded, the ripple effects of Marcus's case extended far beyond the police department. The state legislature, inspired by Marcus's testimony and the findings of the police department's investigation, passed legislation that became known as Marcus's Law. The law required every police department in the state to conduct annual audits of all traffic stops and arrests made during the year. The law required analysis of these stops and arrests by race and ethnicity. The law required documentation of whether racial disparities existed, and if so, whether the disparities were explained by differences in criminal activity patterns or whether they reflected discriminatory policing. The law required that the findings be published publicly and updated annually. The law created a state oversight board that could investigate police departments with significant racial disparities in stops and arrests. Marcus testified before the state Senate about his experience. He spoke about the humiliation of being arrested on false charges while overseeing a job site. He spoke about discovering that Officer Thompson had targeted 5 other people before him. He spoke about finding evidence that the department had institutionalized a quota system that functioned as a mechanism for discriminatory policing. Lawmakers from both parties supported the legislation. Some were driven by the justice imperative, the understanding that people should not be targeted by police based on their race. Others were driven by fiscal responsibility, understanding that the quota system had created enormous liability for cities and states manifested in costly settlements and lawsuits. Marcus's law passed with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the governor. Police departments across the state began implementing the required audits. Many discovered when they actually examined their data that they had the same problem the local department had: a pattern of discriminatory stops and arrests that had gone unexamined and unaddressed for years. Some departments made reforms. Some departments pushed back against the requirements, but the law had created a mechanism for accountability that hadn't existed before. It had created transparency where there had been opacity. It had created a mechanism for detecting patterns of discrimination that had previously been hidden behind administrative processes designed to keep them hidden. The federal investigation into Officer Thompson concluded with findings that he had violated Marcus's civil rights under federal law. The case was referred to the Department of Justice for potential prosecution, though Thompson's status as a terminated officer and his relocation out of state made prosecution complicated. The findings, however, were clear. Thompson had engaged in conduct that violated federal civil rights law. The civil rights organizations that had received half of Marcus's settlement began using those funds to support other victims of police discrimination. They funded legal representation for people who otherwise couldn't afford it. They collected data on police stops and arrests in multiple jurisdictions, analyzing them for racial patterns. They provided training to police departments willing to accept it, educating officers about implicit bias and the damage caused by discriminatory policing. The scholarship fund that Marcus had established received hundreds of applications from minority students interested in law enforcement. Marcus was involved in selecting the first cohort of scholarship recipients. He looked at their applications and their statements about why they wanted to become police officers. Many mentioned their own experiences with police discrimination. Many talked about wanting to be the kind of officer Marcus had demanded Thompson be. An officer who served everyone with dignity. The first group of scholarship recipients included a young black woman from a low-income neighborhood who'd been stopped by police multiple times without cause. It included a young Hispanic man whose father had been affected by a quota-driven traffic stop. It included a young indigenous woman who'd grown up watching her community over-policed and under-protected. They represented the future of policing that Marcus's case had made possible. Officers who understood from personal experience the damage caused by discriminatory policing and who were committed to doing things differently. 1 year after Marcus's promotion, he was invited to speak at the police academy. He stood in front of a room of young recruits, some white, some black, some Hispanic, some of other backgrounds, and he told them his story. "You're about to receive a badge," Marcus said. "That badge comes with authority. You'll have the power to stop people, search people, arrest people. That power is yours to wield or to abuse." Officer Thompson chose to abuse it. He targeted people based on how they looked, and when the system he worked within was exposed, he lost his job and his reputation. "I'm telling you this not to scare you, but to make clear what you're signing up for. You're signing up for responsibility. You're signing up to serve everyone. Not just people who look like you, not just people you're comfortable with, but everyone. If you can't commit to that, you shouldn't be a police officer." The recruits listened. Some looked uncomfortable. Some nodded. All of them heard the message. Accountability was real now. The days of discriminatory policing being tolerated were ending. 1 year after his promotion to regional director, Marcus stood at the top of the building his company had just completed. Sarah stood beside him. 5 projects across the state were now under his management. Hundreds of workers looked to him for leadership. Millions of dollars in resources flowed through his oversight. Below them, visible from the building's rooftop, was the downtown development he'd managed. The project that had been interrupted when Officer Thompson decided to treat him like a criminal. The development was thriving. Businesses were opening. Residents were moving in. The project had become the neighborhood anchor it was designed to be. Marcus looked at the skyline and thought about how close he'd come to accepting that confrontation as just another indignity to swallow. He thought about how easily he could have taken a plea deal on those false charges, paid a fine, moved on. He thought about how many people did exactly that. How many people, when faced with police abuse, simply accepted it because fighting back was too difficult, too expensive, too emotionally exhausting. He thought about James, Keisha, Diana, Robert, and LaToya. People who would never have had justice if Marcus hadn't had the resources to demand it. And he thought about the officers now in training at the academy, learning that accountability was real. He thought about the minority students receiving his scholarship entering law enforcement with eyes open to its problems and committed to being part of the solution. He thought about Marcus's law now in place across the state, creating mechanisms for detecting and addressing discriminatory policing that hadn't existed before. "We changed something," Sarah said, following his gaze across the city. Marcus nodded. "We did." The sun was setting over the city. The light was golden warm transitional, the moment between day and night, between one chapter and another. Marcus and Sarah stood together watching that light, understanding what had been required to get here and what still needed to be done. His phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the scholarship recipients. The young black woman who'd grown up being stopped without cause. She'd been accepted to the police academy. She was about to become the kind of officer she'd wanted to be when she was a teenager being harassed by police who saw her as a threat rather than a person. Marcus smiled when he read the message. Then he put his phone away. He and Sarah walked down from the rooftop together, hand in hand, the city below them, the future uncertain but filled with possibility. Marcus Johnson's story is a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. But justice pursued is justice earned. When we stand up for what's right, even when it costs us, we change not just our own lives, but the lives of everyone who comes after us. That's the power of integrity. That's the power of refusing to accept injustice. And that's the power of picking yourself back up when the system tries to knock you down. Officer Thompson made a choice that day. He chose to let his bias guide him instead of his integrity. Marcus Johnson made a choice too. He chose to let his integrity guide him instead of his anger. Time has shown who made the right choice. If you've been treated unjustly, you have the right to fight back. If you see injustice being done to someone else, you have the responsibility to speak up. Because patterns only change when people refuse to look away. Your voice matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters, and your willingness to stand with others, even when it costs you, changes what's possible. To everyone watching, subscribe to our channel, because stories like Marcus's need to be told, and people who refuse to accept injustice need to be celebrated. Subscribe to be part of a community that stands against discrimination, that demands accountability, and that believes in the fundamental dignity of every person. Thank you for watching.